Hello, everyone. Hi, Kay. It's good to see you. Looks like we got two more people here, but I don't know who they are. They're not showing up on my screen. So it looks like it's going to be just us chickens. Well, if that's so.
Random. AK card.
Oh, so Lana's here too. Kay says shared. Thank you. I did a little sharing myself. Okay, I'm going to start off and hope that a few more people will see fit to join us. Okay, the big news tonight, of course, is that Joe Biden has shared his American Jobs Plan, which had been billed as his infrastructure plan. Hi, Lana, there you are. I see you now. So let's go over it and try to be as brief as possible. I'm going to share the White House brief on his plan. Of course, there's much more detail in it than in the brief, but the brief gives the impression it characterizes the plan as an investment in America that will create millions of good jobs, rebuild our country's infrastructure, and position the United States to outcompete China. A public domestic investment as a share of the economy has fallen by more than 40% since the 1960s. The American Jobs Plan will invest in America in a way we have not invested since we built the interstate highways and won the space race. Well, of course, the space race was during the 1960s. Okay, and a lot of that investment was for equipment that was going to go into space. There was a big investment, though. Of course, the interstate highways were built in the 1950s, largely built in the 1950s. By the 1960s, John Kenneth Galbraith, Jamie's father, wrote two important books. Well, he wrote actually three important books during the 50s and the 60s, but the two I want to refer to here are The Affluent Society in 1958 and The New Industrial State in 1967. Both of those books dealt with the shocking inadequacy of public domestic investment here in the United States. In other words, at the very time the investment was being made in the interstate highway system, and at the very time the investment was being made in the space program, John Kenneth Galbraith was pointing to all of the inadequacies in public investment that still existed at that particular time. So the 1960s were some idyllic time of public investment. There were great shortfalls then too, and things have only gotten worse. Now this bill is proposing to spend, it says, around 1% of GDP on infrastructure. Apparently, both infrastructure and also climate because this is in some part also a climate bill. In some part, it's a care economy bill. So Biden's talking about investing roughly 1% of infrastructure over 8 years in this. Of course, from the CBO point of view, the time horizon of the bill is 10 years, but Biden makes it clear that he's intending it as an 8-year time horizon. So let's take a look at it over 8 years. We come up with something like $287,500,000,000 per year on the average. Is that going to be in deficit spending? No, because Biden says he's going to largely pay for it through taxation. Taxation on the wealthy, taxation on the corporations. That is, he's going to pay for it. Pay for it. As if we pay for anything by taxing for it. He's still putting forward the false idea, the false meme that we ought to pay for things. He didn't say anywhere we must pay for things, but he is saying we ought to pay for this. And that in this program, a spending bill will be not just a spending bill, but a spending bill plus a tax bill. That's what he's saying. And since he's not going to get any Republican help in passing this, if it's to be passed, it has to be passed as a reconciliation bill. So let's keep that in mind. He's planning on putting together a combined reconciliation bill with the spending and the taxing in a single bill. At least that's the way it looks to me. If that's what he's intending, I think that's a terrible strategy. Anyway, the United States of America is the wealthiest country in the world, yet we rank 13th when it comes to the overall quality of our infrastructure. Specifically, the American Society for Engineers says we need to invest $2.9 trillion into our infrastructure to bring it up to snuff. They recently released a 2021 infrastructure report card for this. They do it every year. The $2.9 trillion scorecard is not matched by the size of this bill, apparently not, as we'll see in just a few minutes. After decades of disinvestment, our roads, bridges, and water systems are crumbling. Our electric grid is vulnerable to catastrophic outrages. Too many lack access to affordable, high-speed internet and to quality housing. Not only do they lack access to affordable, high-speed internet, they lack access to free, high-speed internet, Mr. Biden. Since it's hard to trust people in Washington to make a sound judgment about what's affordable for most people and what's not, I'm very suspicious of the word affordable, because the judge of who is affordable is not the people themselves who are going to have to pay the bill. It's usually you rich guys in Washington who don't know what's not affordable anymore. Anyway, high-speed internet and to quality housing. Now, I didn't see affordable quality housing in there. Is it going to be just affordable housing or free housing for those who can't afford it? Anyway, the past years led to job losses and threatened economic security, eroding more than 30 years of progress in women's labor force participation. It has unmasked the fragility of our caregiving infrastructure, and our nation is falling behind its biggest competitors on research and development, manufacturing, and training. It is not falling behind, Mr. Biden. It has fallen behind. Way, way behind. It has never been more important for us to invest in strengthening our infrastructure and competitiveness and in creating the good paying union jobs of the future. I'm all for good paying union jobs. I love those. But I would like to know, first of all, if good paying means at least a living wage. At least a living wage. I think good paying should be something more than a living wage. Maybe twice a living wage, 3 times a living wage. But since we seem to have great trouble providing people with a living wage, well, let's just make sure these good paying jobs are jobs at a living wage at least. Like great projects of the past, the president's plan will unify and mobilize the country to meet the great challenges of our time, the climate crisis and the ambitions of an autocratic China. China is surely autocratic. But it's not just autocratic. It's the most rapidly growing economy in the world that has been revolutionizing its country and bringing far more people out of poverty than live in the United States. It will, going on with this, it will invest in Americans and deliver the jobs and opportunities they deserve. But unlike past major investments, the plan prioritizes addressing longstanding and persistent racial injustice. The plan targets 40% of the benefits of climate and clean infrastructure investments to disadvantaged communities. And the plan invests in rural communities and communities impacted by the market-based transition to clean energy. Specifically, the plan will. Now I'm just going to read the titles of various parts of the plan, maybe throw in a few comments so we can get to the reactions to the plan. First, fix highways, rebuild bridges, upgrade ports, airports, and transit systems. The plan says it's going to modernize 20,000 miles of highways, roads, and main streets. Don't know exactly what that means, of course. It will fix the 10 most economically significant bridges in the country in need, of reconstruction. Off the top of my head, that doesn't sound like it's enough. It seems to me, if you consider the bridges in New York and in San Francisco and in Oakland alone, there's probably 10 bridges there that are economically significant. It also will repair the worst 10,000 smaller bridges, providing critical linkages to communities. That's wonderful. But what happens to the bridges in the middle? And it will replace thousands of buses and rail cars repair hundreds of stations, renew airports, and expand transit and rail into new communities. Well, that is wonderful, but the question is, will it replace all the buses and rail cars that need to be replaced in the country? Will it repair all the stations that need to be repaired in the country? Will it renew all the airports that need to be renewed? Will it build any new airports? Will it expand transit and rail into all the communities to where it should be expanded? Next, the plan will deliver clean drinking water, a renewed electric grid, and high-speed broadband to all Americans. Biden's plan will eliminate all lead pipes and service lines in our drinking water systems. That is wonderful. All lead pipes is wonderful. And reliable broadband, high-speed broadband to every American, wonderful. We surely need that. It will put hundreds of thousands of people to work, laying thousands of miles of transmission lines and capping hundreds of thousands of orphan oil and gas wells and abandoned mines. Work that sorely needs to be done. It will build, preserve, and retrofit more than 2 million homes and commercial buildings, modernize our nation's schools and child care facilities, and upgrades veterans hospitals and federal buildings. Going to another major title, it will solidify the infrastructure of our care economy by creating jobs and raising wages and benefits for essential home care workers. Certainly very, very good and very much needed. But how many jobs? And by how much will the wages be raised? Will they be living wages at last? And what's a living wage? Will it be cost adjusted for the communities across the country that vary so much in their cost of living? Or will there just be a flat rate that's supposed to apply to everyone, whether they serve in the middle of New York or they serve in the middle of Kansas? Revitalize manufacturing, secure U.S. supply chains, invest in R&D, and train Americans for the jobs of the future. Well, that's a little bit broad, isn't it? We don't know exactly what it addresses, but I am reading a summary, to be fair. So we will look more deeply at these things later. Create good quality jobs that pay prevailing wages in safe and healthy workplaces while ensuring workers have a free and fair choice to organize, join a union, and bargain collectively with their employers. Well, what about servers in the restaurant industry? Will good quality jobs for them, are they going to pay a living wage? Because right now, the prevailing wages in the restaurant industry are not living wages by any means. Well, that's what the act is going to do with respect to what it's going to accomplish on the positive side. But alongside this job plan, President Biden is releasing a Made in America tax plan to make sure corporations pay their fair share in taxes and encourage job creation at home. And the statement goes on. Oh, it talks also about Build world-class transportation infrastructure, fix highways, rebuild bridges, and upgrade ports, airports, and transit systems. And it says, President Biden is calling on Congress to make a historic and overdue investment in our roads, bridges, rail, ports, airports, and transit systems. The President's plan will ensure that these investments produce good quality jobs with strong labor standards, prevailing wages, and a free and fair choice to join a union and to bargain a collective. That, of course, is very important. President Biden's plan will deliver infrastructure Americans can trust because it will be resilient to floods, firestorms, and other threats, and not fragile in the face of these increasing risks. And it goes on to say much of the same of what I've already indicated, but in more detail, talking about the 35,000 people who die in traffic crashes on U.S. roads each year. But by the way, a lot more people die from lack of health insurance than die in traffic crashes on U.S. roads each year. Just saying. So this fills in some of the details of what we talked about before, okay, in general. So it puts a little more flesh on the bones of the plan. One big item worth mentioning is create good jobs electrifying vehicles. The U.S. market share of plug-in electric vehicle sales is only 1/3 the size of the electric vehicle market in China. The President believes that must change. He's proposing $174 billion investment to win the EV market. I don't know what winning the EV market means, but I'm pretty sure $174 billion over 8 years, or roughly, what is that, $25 billion a year or something like that, or $23 billion a year. That's not going to do it. His plan will enable automakers to spur domestic supply chains from raw materials to parts, retool factories to compete globally, and support American workers to make batteries and electric vehicles. It will give consumers point-of-sale rebates and tax incentives to buy American-made EVs, while ensuring that these vehicles are affordable for all families and manufactured by workers with good jobs. It will establish grant and incentive programs for state and local governments and the private sector to build a national network of 500,000 electric vehicle chargers by 2030, while promoting strong labor, training, and installation standards. His plan will also replace 50,000 diesel transit vehicles and electrify at least 20% of our yellow school bus fleet through a new Clean Buses for Kids program at the EPA, with support from the Department of Energy. What's wrong with replacing all our yellow school bus fleet with electric vehicles? Couldn't we afford that, Joe Biden? Couldn't we afford that? Is there some kind of problem affording that over 10 years? Is that what's going on here? We have to watch how much we spend to save ourselves from the climate emergency. He's calling on Congress to invest $25 billion in our airports, including funding for the airport improvement program. Okay. I hate to mention this, but it costs more than $25 billion to pay the airline workers during the pandemic so they still had jobs. If he thinks 25 billion is going to be enough to invest in our airport, I don't know where he came up with that figure from or where his people came up with that figure from. That looks awfully low to me. President Biden is calling on Congress to invest an additional 17 billion in inland waterways, coastal ports, land ports of entry, and ferries, which are all essential to our nation's freight. This includes a healthy ports program to mitigate the cumulative impacts of air pollution on neighborhoods near ports, often communities of color. Only 17 billion for that. Over 8 years, a little more than 2 billion a year. Is that really enough for that? Gee. He says the transportation plan is not just ambitious in scale, it's designed with equity in mind and to set up America for the future. Too often, past transportation investments divided communities, like the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans or I-81 in Syracuse. I remember I-81 in Syracuse. Or it left out the people most in need of affordable transportation options. The president's plan includes $20 billion for a new program that will reconnect neighborhoods cut off by historic investments and ensure new projects increase opportunity, advance racial equity and environmental justice, and promote affordable access. Then they make a number of other claims in the plan. I'm not going to go through the details. He puts a price, though, on all of these things. And I think it's time to shift gears a little bit, stop sharing the official statement, okay, of the White House, and begin to share a handy-dandy little chart that was put together by the Washington Post. Dealing with what's in the plan. Let me see. Here it is. So you should be seeing this on your screen now. It's a little bigger, easier to see now. So the infrastructure plan covers manufacturing and caretaking. It covers infrastructure at home, $650 billion for that. Clean drinking water, $111 billion. High-speed broadband, $100 billion. The electrical infrastructure, $100 billion. For affordable and sustainable housing, $213 billion. Roughly, what is that? It's 25 billion a year, something like 27 billion a year. Yeah, maybe 26 billion a year. Public schools, early learning centers, and community colleges, 137 billion for that. And there's another category of 28 billion for infrastructure at home. I'm not sure what that's for. Transportation infrastructure, 621 million. Highways, bridges, and roads, 115 billion. Somehow, I don't think that's going to be enough. Public transit, 85 billion. Passenger and freight rail, 80 billion. Electric vehicles, 174 billion. 42 billion for airports, water transit, and ports. That's only 4.2 billion per year. Sorry. It's about 5.4 billion, 5.2 billion per year in round figures for airports, water transit, and ports. Transportation inequities, 45 billion. Infrastructure resilience, 50 billion. Other, 30 billion. That's 621 billion. 650 billion, 621 billion is 1,271 billion. Now we move to some other categories. R&D, workforce development, okay, and the manufacturing. R&D, 180 billion. Manufacturing and small business, 300 billion. Workforce development, 100 billion. That's 580 billion. Home and community-based care for elderly and disabled people, which last time I looked, is not infrastructure. I don't know why this isn't in the second half of the program, which is supposed to be the part that is devoted to the care economy. Now, something was hinted at by Dave Dayen yesterday that maybe this 400 billion for the caretaking economy is here just in case Biden can't get through a bill for the caretaking economy. So he wants to get at least some money, at least 50 billion a year for that, wrapped into this bill, which he thinks he'll be able to pass, okay, especially since he's proposing to pay for it. Anyway, if we add up the 1.271 billion and the 980 billion for these other two categories, we come close to roughly, I think it's 2.25 billion, something like that. Let me just do that. 1,271 plus 980 equals, we come to 2.25 $1 trillion then. There's another 39 billion somewhere which wasn't accounted for in here, as given by this little note, okay, at the bottom. It brings the $650 billion in spending up to 689 billion, adds another 39 billion in there. So it brings up the total to close to $2.3 trillion over an 8-year period. 2.3 divided by 8. It means 287 billion 500 million per year is what he's proposing here. And he's proposing to pay for a very high percentage of it. I think here he's proposing deficit spending of about $500 million over that period of time. So if it's scored as the CBO usually does over a 10-year period, there's only 50 billion here in deficit spending over 10 years. We need a lot more deficit spending than that. Why? Because that won't compensate for the loss of dollars to foreign trade. It doesn't come near to compensating for the loss of dollars to foreign trade. Now, maybe there were other bills that will run deficits large enough to compensate for that. But my point is, from a sectoral balances perspective, this is not a good bill. It runs deficits that are far too small. Far too small. And I think you can see when we go over the details of these figures that they aren't fit for purpose. You can't do affordable and sustainable housing for the whole country over an 8-year period for $213 billion. It ain't going to happen. It just ain't going to happen. Now, maybe that's good, because maybe we'll see bills in fiscal 2022 or fiscal 2023. Maybe we'll see bills that will add on to this and continue the spending. Maybe. If the Democrats retain control of Congress, maybe. But if they don't, because the economy goes bad, because the deficits are too low, that's not going to help. There is a statement from the Washington Post, Mr. Bezos's paper, which says the following, quote, "The spending in the plan would end decades of stagnation in federal investment in research and infrastructure, and would return government investment in those areas as a share of the economy to its highest levels since the 1960s. Well, that's nice, but it's not the question. The question is, what levels should it be at in order to solve the problem of terribly lacking federal investment in research and infrastructure since the 1960s. Quote again, "Many of the items in the plan carry price tags that would have filled entire ambitious bills in past administrations." Yes, because those bills were so terrible. Mr. Biden's pledge to tackle climate change is embedded throughout the plan. Plans to retrofit and weatherize millions of buildings would make them more energy efficient. It's welcome that he begins this kind of activity. It isn't near enough being spent on that. Quote again from the Post, "The plan proposes spending $174 billion to encourage manufacture and purchase of electric vehicles." Again, nowhere near enough. Would fund the construction of about 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations. $100 billion in programs to update and modernize the electric grid. A federal mandate requiring that a certain percentage of electricity in the United States be generated by zero carbon energy sources. Well, there might be a mandate, but who is mandated? And how's it going to be enforced? $46 billion for government agencies to buy fleets of electric vehicles. Hopefully that would be enough. Hopefully they have a handle on what that would cost. $16 billion program intended to help fossil fuel workers transition to new work. I don't have a comment on that. I don't have a feel for how much that would cost, since I suspect a lot of the fossil fuel workers will be able to find employment in the green power sector, which is, according to certain articles I've been reading, about to go freaking crazy, about to exponentially expand and explode. Anyway, I have no feel for how much money would be needed for the transition for that. But the 16 billion program over 8 years is only 2 billion a year. That doesn't pay for too much. 10 billion for a new civilian climate corps and would eliminate tax preferences for fossil fuel producers. That sounds wonderful, Mr. Biden, but 10 billion over 8 years is a little more than 1 billion a year. What is it? 1.2 billion per year. 1.25 billion per year, right? Over 8 years. You're not going to get much of a civilian climate corps for 1.25 billion a year, Mr. Biden. That's not going to happen. The Post goes on and says, among them, a total of 180 billion for research and development. Okay, again, that's only 18 billion a year. 115 billion for roads and bridges. 85 billion for public transit, 80 billion for Amtrak and freight rail. There's 42 billion for ports and airports. We've already been over that. And 100 billion. Well, so the Post is basically quoting all this, and its quotes seem to be oriented towards, oh, this is really a great plan. This is really something that we should be proud of, and he should be proud of. That's the impression you get. Okay, so let's now go to let's start to get into the critics, because there are other critics besides me. It's a piece by Jake Johnson from Common Dreams today. Jake's piece. Critics warn Biden infrastructure plan, quote, falls woefully short on climate crisis. What a surprise. President Biden's rollout of a $2.26 trillion infrastructure and climate spending blueprint on Wednesday was met with icy response from progressive advocacy groups and environmentalists who argued the proposal in its current form is inadequate to the task of combating the climate crisis by overhauling the nation's polluting energy and transportation systems. Now, let's keep the context of this clear. In the last number of days, Biden was floating a $3 trillion infrastructure plan. This was notable because it was less than Joe Manchin's stated preference for a $4 trillion infrastructure plan. It was also far less than the Thrive agenda being sponsored by a number of congressional people, Ed Markey included, and being pushed by loads and loads of climate groups. That plan was for $1 trillion a year for 10 years, or $10 trillion. So, of course, a plan 1/5 that size was going to be met with an icy response. I'll go over some of the quotes in just a minute, but I would like to note, and I think it's fairly important to note, if I can find it here, that Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal plan okay, let me see. I got it. What happened? I tried to save this page to a PDF file just before coming on here, and it got totally screwed up. So, what I'm going to do shouldn't be too hard to bring it up. While I was preparing this, I couldn't but recall what Bernie did during his campaign, because it was so notable compared to this plan. The Bernie's plan was incredibly detailed, and not just incredibly detailed, but it was also a Green New Deal plan for, I cannot find it now, that it was for $16.3 trillion. I remember that very well, over 10 years. So, Bernie was talking about an average of $1.6 trillion per year. 8 times the size of the plan that Biden has introduced here. For that matter, I think that Biden's campaign plan was bigger than what he has here. I haven't noticed the climate emergency getting any less worse during this period of time, but let us move to the comments of others. Biden's industry-friendly infrastructure plan squanders one of our last best chances to stop the climate emergency, warned Brett Hartl, Government Affairs Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. Instead of a Marshall Plan approach that moves our economy to renewable energy, it includes gimmicky subsidies for carbon capture, fantastically wishes the free market will save us, and fails to take crucial and ambitious steps towards phasing out fossil fuels. Quote, Biden has pledged to cut carbon emissions 50% and decarbonize our electricity sector. He added, quote again, but this proposal won't even come close. Well, we have to note this plan represents the first half of a two-pronged recovery proposal that the Biden administration is planning to detail in the coming days with the healthcare focus second part expected sometime next month. Late Wednesday afternoon, Biden is set to deliver a speech in Pittsburgh. That was this afternoon. I didn't see that speech, outlining the infrastructure and climate portion of the package, which calls for just over $2 trillion in total spending over the next 8 years. So we've seen that. We've gone through the fact sheet. We don't have to repeat that. But Winona Howder, executive director of Food and Water Watch, said that while Biden's proposal is, quote, more ambitious than previous efforts, the American Jobs Plan still falls woefully short of truly addressing the multiple crises facing our country and our planet. The investments in our electric power system are too small to transition to 100% clean renewable energy. We'll continue to waste money on dirty nuclear energy, and will send subsidies to fossil fuel corporations by devoting funding to carbon capture schemes. Howder argued the funding levels outlined in the White House plan are simply inadequate to meet the essential task of replacing our nation's crumbling water infrastructure while assuring clean, safe, and affordable water for all. And Greenpeace USA said we need at POTUS to step it up. That's where you come in. Thousands of grassroots activists are demanding Biden go bigger and bolder, from Alaska to Guam. We're rising up for a recovery plan that puts people first. Are you in? Then there's a link to Thrive, recoveryrecess.org. which is the organizing site. The American Jobs Plan, which the president wants to finance by ending fossil fuel subsidies and raising taxes on the wealthy and large corporations, is Biden's opening bid to members of Congress, who have already begun aggressively jockeying over the framework specifics. Centrist Democrats are balking at the plan's price tag and proposed tax increases. And the progressive lawmakers are warning the White House's framework doesn't offer anywhere near close to sufficient spending to tackle the present crises of climate change, mass unemployment, and crumbling infrastructure. Quote, "This is not nearly enough," Representative AOC said of Biden's proposal late on Tuesday. Yes, she did. In marked contrast to Biden's call for just over $2 trillion in spending over the next 8 years, Ed Markey is pushing for $10 trillion in spending over the next decade on infrastructure, renewable energy development, clean public transit, and more. O'Connor said, with up to $1 trillion per year over the next decade, we can make critical and productive investments in clean energy, job creation, on our nation's infrastructure, unquote, he said. You know, folks, 10 trillion isn't enough. Even Bernie's 16.3 trillion over 10 years was not enough. You know, getting hold of this climate crisis is going to cost at least double that amount. It's going to cost at least as much per year as Medicare for all is going to cost. We can't expect it to cost any less. I mean, this is all fantasy. People have to start dealing with the real problems we have, particularly the problem of likely survival. As the Biden White House unveiled the details of his infrastructure spending plan on Wednesday, a coalition of more than 50 think tanks and advocacy organizations urged the president and congressional Democrats to embrace demands of the progressives for $10 trillion in spending over the next decade. Matt Hayward, Legislative Affairs Director at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, said in a statement Wednesday that, quote, the compounding crises of our country faces extreme poverty, emboldened white supremacy, and the climate crisis demonstrate the need for Biden and Congress to go bold and go fast. Yes, because the 2022 elections are there to be won. They will not be won with cautious policies that do not deficit spend enough and that thereby jeopardize employment for people. They will not be won by policies that do not guarantee employment for people. Now is the time for a federal job guarantee at a living wage to supply local communities with the needs that cannot and are not being fulfilled by the private sector. Quote, the priorities the president is laying out today begin the process of building back from this crisis, but don't go nearly far enough, unquote. Hayward argued. Quote, our families and communities need and deserve so much more, and they need it now. In a blog post on Wednesday, Josh Bivens of the Economic Policy Institute sketched out a rough estimate of the spending that would likely be necessary over the next decade to meet the country's most pressing needs in the areas of infrastructure, green energy investment, higher education, and health care. And Bivens put the ideal level of spending at just under $10.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, EPI and Josh Bivens, but EPI in general, always wants to be seen as respectable. The gatekeepers of the respectable left. They always underestimate how much is going to be necessary when it comes to spending. Always, always, always. If they put it at 10.5 trillion, take my word for it, that's not enough. Quote, the case for undertaking another round of ambitious public investment, Bivens wrote, rests simply on the fact that they will help provide a better and fairer society, unquote. No. The case for undertaking another round of ambitious public investments is that without them, we won't survive the climate emergency. That is the case. And that's why arguments over piddling amounts like 2.2 trillion over 8 years or 10.5 trillion over the next 10 years even are unfruitful arguments. We have to meet the scale of the problem. So here's another reaction. This one is from Ryan Cooper, who, since he writes his column fairly late in the day, was able to get in his opinion on this. And Ryan said, Ryan Cooper, that is, as opposed to Ryan Grimm, Ryan Cooper said Biden is still not taking climate change seriously. I get that impression too, don't you? President Biden has released detail of his infrastructure program. It's a big bill, priced at roughly $2.8 trillion over a decade. So you see, the price of this is put at $2.8 trillion as opposed to $2.3 trillion, where I had it based on the WAPO chart. So that's another 500 billion. Let's see where the rest comes in. With tons of money for repairs, maintenance, trains, green investment, and more, as well as a lot of other stuff. It would be paid for with hikes in income and corporate tax rates. Now that's the trap. How are we going to pay for it? Biden fell into that trap. Oh, by the way, this isn't a bill, Ryan. It's a plan. There's nobody saying it has to be a bill. And about this, I have to say, I have to point out, as I told you yesterday, they can do a spending bill for fiscal 2021. They can do a taxing bill for 2021. And they can also do a debt bill for 2021. Now, I have a particular debt bill that I would like to get passed using reconciliation. My debt bill is a proposal to pay off all the federal debt as it falls due, and to pay for it using platinum coins. So I propose that as part of this particular debt bill, that the Secretary of the Treasury order the Director of the Mint to mint $100 trillion platinum coin and deposit it in the Public Enterprise Fund account, whereupon the Treasury will sweep the seigniorage, almost the entire $100 trillion, into the Treasury spending account. And from then on, whatever debt the federal government chooses to incur, and all previous past debt, which is roughly at the level of $25 trillion now, would be paid as it falls due. Not faster, as it falls due. So there is no inflation that comes about from paying it off too fast. That would be a wonderful way of using the provision in reconciliation that provides for a bill that addresses debt. Then we could also have a separate bill addressing taxes. That's the bill where the president can argue with the centrists, with Josh Gottheimer and the other nincompoops, concerning how much of this spending is going to be paid for and how much is not. And let's let the progressives get in on this too and advocate for the proper amount of deficit spending so we're not faced with an unemployment problem again in 2 years. How about that? So we can have a taxing bill, we can have a debt bill, and then we can have a spending bill. And that bill can take Biden's spending plan of $2.8 trillion over a decade and let everybody on the Democratic side propose the spending that they would like to see, provided only that it has to be related to the climate emergency. And let's see what we come out with. let's see if we come out with that $10 trillion plan, or let's see if we come out with a $16 trillion plan, or let's see if we come out with a $32 trillion plan. I guarantee that whatever we come up with, the federal government will be able to afford that. After all, even if it's a $32 trillion plan, it's only going to average $3.2 trillion a year. That's no problem. We could easily afford the federal job guarantee, because that's going to start off maybe spending $650 billion a year. But it'll probably go down once full employment is reached, true full employment. It will go down to roughly $250 to $300 billion a year. That's only roughly 1/10 of the $3.2 trillion a year. That's barely going to make a dent in it. Anyway, going on with Ryan's thing. A main objective of the plan is supposed to be tackling climate change. Judging by the standards of American politics, it is quite aggressive. But judged by the standards of Biden's campaign platform, more importantly, by the standards of what is needed to combat climate change, the proposal falls short of the mark. Woefully short of the mark. America will need bolder action than this to do its part in the global fight to preserve a livable climate. And as far as displacing the Chinese from #1 in the electrical vehicle market, he can forget about that. The $174 billion is nowhere near enough to do that. Since everything is more expensive here than it is in China, they can probably match that $174 billion with only $35 billion in spending in China. And of course, they could even do the spending in dollars, since they've got 1.3 trillion of our dollars they can call on, right? First, the good, says Ryan. Biden would invest $85 billion in public transit agencies, $80 billion in Amtrak, and $174 billion in electrical vehicles. That's a doubling of federal funding for transit and a quadrupling for intercity rail. He would invest $35 billion in green research directly and another $155 billion in general research, including advanced energy technology. Most importantly, there are $400 billion in clean energy tax credits for things like wind farms, rooftop solar, home insulation upgrades, and so forth, which will have a climate impact in the trillions. These credits were mysteriously not included in the administration's headline price tag. All that is great stuff, says Ryan. I'm afraid I don't agree with him. I don't think it's great enough. But anyway, but in terms of climate, this proposal is a substantial downgrade from his campaign pledge. What has Biden been doing these last few weeks? I'm going to digress a little again. For these last a few weeks, he floated the $3 trillion. Manchin said that's not enough, and the progressives said we need $10 trillion. So he goes down to $2.3 trillion. What's he doing? What's he doing? Or as Ryan says, to $2.9 trillion? What's he doing? He floated those figures to try to get a reaction from people. He got a reaction from people saying, look how poor this is. It's not even as much as Joe Manchin wanted to do. So what was Biden thinking? What's his team thinking? Did a bigger plan go against the interests of BlackRock? Was it torpedoed by the head of the National Economics Council, who hopes to go back there after he's finished? in this administration? Send them back there now. We don't need them. The 180 billion in research is welcome. But he previously promised 400 billion focused entirely on climate. There is also 400 billion in elder care, which is welcome, of course, but has little to do with climate or even infrastructure. The 115 billion for road maintenance and money to replace every lead water pipe in the country is similarly vital, but largely unrelated to climate. The electric vehicle spending will help, but it lamentably ignores the far greater promise of electric bicycles. Though the focus on electric buses and post office vehicles is good. I like the idea of electric bicycles, but I have to confess, I never learned how to ride a bike. I don't know if my balance was good enough for me to ride a bike. I don't know if I'd ever be able to ride a bike. Well, maybe I can have a sidecar so it's just as stable as a car and then I can go. At bottom, it isn't really a climate bill. It's a grab bag of some infrastructure stuff, some climate stuff, and some elder care stuff. Exactly, Ryan. Despite the large headline price, it isn't that big either, just 1% of GDP. Right. You're telling me with a crisis reportedly as big as World War II, an existential crisis, we can't afford 5% of GDP? 5% of GDP. Well, GDP is what, about 23 trillion right now, something like that. So that would be what, 1.25 trillion per year would be 5%. That's 12 trillion, 500 billion. That's a lot more than 2.9 trillion. Neither does Biden address the biggest element of his campaign's climate plan, international cooperation. Climate change is a global problem, and the U.S. is not even close to the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world now. China emits fully twice as much as the U.S., and India emits nearly as much as the entire EU. The key tasks for global climate policy will be to help or coax China into slashing its emissions and to prevent the rest of the developing world from following China's coal-powered model. I suspect the Chinese are going to take care of that themselves. As the Chinese have said in the context of their Belt and Road initiatives, with other countries, and costing out the projects they undertake, the Chinese have been quoted as saying, "We are not stupid." They are not stupid enough to continue practices that would be life endangering. Their far superior response to the COVID crisis, far superior to our response to the COVID crisis, illustrates that in spades. They will get their coal-powered model under control and end it at the rate we're going long before we get rid of our fossil fuel dependence. It's a striking absence given that Biden also proposes to revolutionize international corporate taxation. He would institute a 21% minimum tax on American corporate taxes and close many loopholes that allow U.S. companies to book their profits in low-tax foreign countries. More importantly, he proposes to set up a global minimum corporate tax through international agreements. As economist Gabriel Zuckman points out, if Biden could get this done, and the U.S. has many ways to pressure other nations to agree, especially given that it would be in their interest anyway, it would end the scourge of beggar thy neighbor tax havens which have driven the race to the bottom in corporate tax rates. That's an excellent idea, but it doesn't have anything directly to do with the climate, says Ryan. Taxing the corporations is going to be popular, but taxing the corporations alone and getting a few more jobs for Americans, because there's no way this program is large enough to deliver the kinds of jobs that we're going to need. Bernie's plan was about creating 20 million jobs. The Thrive agenda from the progressives is claiming what? Is it 15 million jobs? Or I think it's 15 million jobs. And Biden is claiming that this program, his program, is going to create 10 million jobs. No way, Jose. He doesn't have enough devoted to job creation in this. And especially not since the deficit spending he's trying to incorporate in this plan is wholly inadequate for getting big multiplier effects. He needs bigger deficit spending to get the multiplier effects that would be needed to get everybody working. Where is the job guarantee program in this program? Where is it? I don't see it. Anyway, Ryan points out Biden's whole package is focused almost entirely within the U.S., trying to encourage domestic investment and help Americans above all. This surely isn't the end of Biden's climate policy. There are a lot of other things he could do with regulations, trade deals, or just more legislation. But it will be hard enough to get just this one package through the Senate. It's entirely possible this will be his only serious climate bill. As the legislation works through Congress, climate hawks should work to make it more ambitious and aggressive. If they don't, clockwork climate disasters will continue to wreak ever greater havoc across the country and the world. And Ryan is dead right about that. I entirely agree with him. And I am about to bring that up in just a few minutes. That's why I've emphasized for you that this is only a bill. Next thing I wanted to show you was a piece by Jessica Corbett on the 30th. Piecemeal solutions won't suffice, and progressives press Biden to go big on the infrastructure plan. And this is about the Thrive Act, okay, and the Thrive agenda. And I've basically gone over this already, the basics. $10 trillion plan over a decade. It would immediately create 372,000 jobs for Pennsylvania. We wanted that number right up there where President Biden could see it, said Tejas Carrero, State Director of CASA-PA, a group involved with the Billboard effort. That is the Billboard effort in favor of the Thrive agenda, which is part of the 2-week recovery recess campaign pushing for a pandemic package modeled after the Thrive agenda. Carrero added that 372,000 jobs would not only revitalize our community, but give hope to the next generation of Pennsylvanians that their futures won't be defined by crisis, but by opportunity. And the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, on job creation in the state if Congress and Biden enacted the Thrive Act. This is pushed, okay, in the billboards it was Peary who did the cost estimates for the Thrive agenda. They're the ones who came up with the $10 trillion cost. Okay, this article goes through some of the details of that. I've been through some of these details already. It looks like, Kenyella Ng, who I interviewed when he was a candidate for Congress, is working activism on the Thrive agenda. And there's a video in this article from him. And he's pushing the Thrive agenda. So there are some quotes, okay, from other people, but you should go through and read more about what people are saying on the Thrive agenda. It would be a great improvement over Biden's bill. And finally, here is Ocasio. Everybody wondering whether Ocasio was getting too cozy with Biden. Ocasio-Cortez says Biden infrastructure plan needs to be way bigger. This is by Kenny Stansel from Common Dreams today, and there's a picture of AOC. With President Joe Biden expected to unveil the first part of his jobs and infrastructure plan, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is warning the $2.26 trillion proposal does not come close to meeting the scale of the unemployment, inequality, and climate crisis facing a nation and the world. She says the jobs plan is spread out over nearly a decade. Well, it's 8 years, but it's close enough. And the progressive stalwart added that the Biden administration, which is vowed to build back better, needs to embrace a much more ambitious agenda for an equitable and green economic recovery. Now, let's go to what the hell is going on here. Biden has given us a plan, at least the first half of one. Hasn't given us the care economy part of the plan yet. He still is working that out. Okay. Meanwhile, the Time to Thrive events are going on all over the country, pressuring for better legislation in this area that Biden has been able to come up with. But Biden is not getting this passed without another reconciliation bill. So, who's going to be putting together the framework for the reconciliation bill? Well, in the House, of course, Nancy Pelosi is going to be tremendously influential in relation to that particular framework. But in the Senate, the person who can really have a lot to say about that particular framework is Senator Bernard Sanders. That's in his ballpark as the chairperson of the Budget Committee. So he's going to be there. Is he going to be there for what is needed? Is he going to try to introduce a spending framework that is consistent with his own platform? I certainly hope so. And I urge you to go to berniesanders.com and and to try to pull up the platform and go through the Green New Deal provision of it, okay, again, and see the detail. I want Bernie to try to insist on those details and those numbers and those expenditures from his end, and for the progressives in the House to do the same, to take his platform and to try to get Bernie's platform passed through the House. I want to see the Congressional Progressive Caucus. I want to see them lobby for that. I want to see them push for that. I want to see them insist on that. And I want that minimum wage provision back in this infrastructure bill. We went over that. There's no reason why that should not be in this bill. The parliamentarian, as I've said often, is just, he is just, or she is just an advisor. Nobody has to take her advice. Time for the progressives to insist that nobody take her advice, while arguing, of course, that it's obvious that in relation to this infrastructure bill, the minimum wage is going to have a very strong budgetary impact. Changes in the minimum wage will have a very strong budgetary impact, and therefore the minimum wage provision is consistent with the requirements for a reconciliation bill. They should argue that as strongly as they can, get Biden and Harris to accept it, signal a parliamentarian, she can give her advice, but if it's not the right advice, it's just going to be ignored. I think that's what has to be done. I think this bill, it should be dead on arrival among the progressives in the Congress. Dead on arrival. It's a centrist, neoliberal bill. It focuses on paying for things that don't have to be paid for. The pay for should not even be in this bill. As I told you yesterday, they can do 3 reconciliation bills in the same year. 1 for spending, 1 for taxing, and 1 for debt. I've told you what I want for those 3 bills. That's what I think should be done. I'll go to your comments now.
I got one.
Oh, Bonnie's got a comment. So,
I want corporate America to do something really nice for America, since we were here to help them become billionaires. They could help with the reconstruction.
okay, I'm afraid we have to go into the details of that because
How do you get your name on it?
no, okay, it's not a question of names on it, okay, or anything like that. It's a question of whether any regulatory provisions with respect to corporate America, okay, or getting the corporate America to do anything would be good for the bill or would be counterproductive. In other words, in the past, partnerships of the government with the corporate America have been examples of lemon socialism,
Okay.
where the government takes the risk and corporate America gets the rewards. I don't want to bring any lemon socialism into these bills. Okay?
Let me take it back.
You have to be very careful when it comes to inviting corporate America in, because they never do anything out of the goodness of their hearts. Corporations are not supposed to have hearts. They're supposed to pursue profit. That is their function. Okay? Their function is not to do public purpose. Our function is to make them act in such a way that it's consistent with the public purpose. Okay, Kay says, hi all, glad to see you. I guess I've been through the hi alls. Kay says, where's Dolores Pierce? I don't know. Who else was talking tonight? Carmen says, hi, Dr. J and Bonnie, always a pleasure to be here. Some heck of a news coming around the bend. Johnson & Johnson whole shipment of the COVID vaccine? Why, in heaven's name? Why did they hold shipments of COVID? Kay says, Evelina Pont. Evelina says, hi, Pay. Hi, Kay. Kay says, hi, Evelina. Carmen says, still sharing and inviting. Thank you, Carmen. Terry says, greetings, Doc and Bonnie. Greetings, Terry. And Dolores says, Kay Clark Ryan. Hi, everyone. There's Dolores. And Terry says, hiya, charming Carmen. Thank you for the invite. Kay says, hearing 15 million J&J vax have been ruined, per New York Times and Politico. Shake my head. How could they be ruined? I thought those could easily be shipped. Kay says, seems like a good start plan to me if we can get it passed. No, it's not good enough, because it will be the last spending bill that they can submit under reconciliation in fiscal 21. So this bill has to do everything we need to have done in fiscal 21, Kay. That's why it's so important. And it has to be big enough that if the Democratic Party passes it, they will be heroes to all Americans, so that there is no possibility for Donald Trump and the Republicans to get back into power in 2023. Because I'm telling you, Kay, if they get back in 2023, we are all doomed. We have tough enough time getting the Democratic Party to do things that are good for us. But if the Republicans come back in, I mean, it's doomsday. Bonnie asks, but do you think we will get solar-powered buses? I think we can get solar-powered buses. I don't see why not. I don't know whether we can get them in the next 10 years or so. They're not specified in this bill, of course. Kay says, need those, Bonnie. Carmen says, can be done in a jiffy. The technology already exists. Terry says, Carmen Muniz, yes, since the 60s and 70s, says Terry Burke. Evelina Pont says, only 20% of school buses electrified over 10 years. Ridiculous. That is ridiculous, isn't it, Evelina? Ridiculous. I read Biden had a tough time communicating today. Had a touch time communicating. Then Terry says tough. Evelina says, Terry Burke, that's not good. Yeah, why was he... Terry says, yeah, they went hard on him with ridicule. Who did? Kay says, he sounded fine to me. I watched it all. Terry says, well, what article did I read then? It seemed he lost whole sentences and seemed scatterbrained. He always seems scatterbrained. He can lose whole sentences. That's part of his charm. You missed that about Biden. He's got a certain popular charm, like, he's like all of us. He's Mr. Working Man. And Mr. Working Man is not always completely coherent. Okay, says, not sure, Terry, but I watched it live. Evelina says, good things in bill, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. Not all that ambitious, I'm afraid. Terry says, oh, okay, that's weird. So maybe I read an old article and I mistook it as current. Kay says, I agree, Evelina, but at least it is a start in the right direction more than ever before. Carmen says that Macron shut down France for 3 weeks, schools too, of course. Yeah, oh, they're getting hit bad by B117 over there. Evelina says, oh, and we're getting hit by it bad here too. But today I came across some CDC statistics that said 26% of the cases we have in the United States right now are B117 cases. So it's beginning to take over as the dominant form, okay, of COVID. Evelina says, for sure, Kay, but remember, it is over 10 years. That's a long time. I'm worried about the climate crisis and what it will do over that span of time. Me too. Evelina says span, not spam. Yeah, I got that, Evelina. Kay says, I understand, Evelina, but we have to start somewhere and hope this can even get passed. It can get passed. They have the 50 votes. It can get passed. They have to make deals with people. They're going to have to put fat in this bill to make deals with people. By the way, they're going to have to make a deal with the few congressmen who didn't like the state and local tax deduction. Josh Gottheimer, Bill Pascrell, and I forget who the third one was. I think she's a California congresswoman. But the basic point there is they didn't like that the state and local tax deduction was limited to $10,000. They claim that there are a lot of middle-class people who are victimized by that, and they should not be victimized. To me, the way you get rid of that is easy. I know that these three congresspeople want to completely get rid of the state and local tax deduction because the rich people, the donors in their districts, don't want to have to start paying taxes when you pass the $10,000 limit, or even the $15,000 limit, or even the $20,000 limit, because they have mansions, and maybe they owe $50,000 in taxes, and they want to be able to deduct those taxes. I should say the deductions, but based on those taxes. In other words, they might owe $50,000 in state and local taxes. They want to be able to deduct the whole $50,000. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? But from the standpoint of these particular congressmen, even though that's what their donors want them to do, this is a case where they have to justify it in terms of the middle class people who live in their district. Now, there should be statistics available in their district about how many people pay more in state and local taxes than 10,000? How many pay more than 15,000? How many pay more than 20,000? I'll bet there are not many middle class people who pay more than 15,000 in state and local taxes. So that's what we're talking about here. The way the congressmen are trying to present it is, we're not going to vote for anything except, the only way we're going to vote for something, a tax bill, is if it repeals that state and local tax deduction. Well, we can't allow that. We can't allow that. Because that's just for the rich. But the three people who would vote against that cannot justify their vote by saying they were trying to save that money for the rich. They have to say they were trying to save money for middle class constituents. So you go up, you make the limit 15,000. Or if necessary, you make the limit 20,000. But basically, you don't let Bill Gates take off all the state and local taxes on his mansion. See what I'm saying? Something like 60% of the benefit of that change to state and local would go to billionaires or the very, very rich. So what you do is you negotiate a new limit with them. They don't like 10,000, maybe they'll find 15,000 more acceptable or 10,000 more acceptable. You'll be able to make a deal with those guys on that. You can trade them. They get a better deal on state and local tax deductions. And they get off this BS about having to have no deficit spending on this bill, or very little deficit spending on this bill. You make them back off their deficit spending demands, but you can bargain with them. So Terry says, Kay says, the GOP have been running this country backwards for many decades. Terry says, Stiglitz likes the infrastructure bill a lot. Well, I like Joe Stiglitz. I think Joe Stiglitz is a fine guy. But truth to tell, Joe Stiglitz isn't really very radical when you come right down to it. He pretty much stands, I'm not even sure that he's to the left of the Peary people or the EPI people. I'm also not sure that he's really up to snuff when it comes to what's needed in order to get rid of the climate emergency. Okay, and I know that even though Joe Stiglitz is friendly, with MMTers, he is not an MMTer. He believes that too much debt is no good for a monetary sovereign. He's still there with that kind of non-existent problem. Kay says, we're only number 13 in infrastructure worldwide. It's amazing, huh? Dear Swift is here and says, hi, finally made it again, Lana. She says, hi, Lana. Hi, dear. And Kay says, my grandson is in the fracking business. Okay, I worry about him a lot. Yeah, it would be great if he could shift over to clean energy, wouldn't it? Evelina says, does he? Well, that's a vote of confidence, but is he an expert on a green economy? Dia Swift said, sounds like Biden austerity incrementalism. I think there's some of that here. I don't think that Biden has gotten it through his thick skull that there's no such thing as austerity other than what the decision makers in Washington impose. Austerity is not a naturally occurring thing. It's not a naturally required thing. It's not a thing the economy does to us. It's a thing the government does to us when it gets the mistaken idea that we cannot pay our bills when they're too large. They cannot be too large. Evelina says, but let's hope he can train to transition. Lana says, how is everything, Dia? And Kay says, I hope he's smart enough to go for that. And Kay says that part of the family isn't too smart and pretty redneck too. Evelina says, Doctor, how much are they allocating for the military? Oh, gee, if they keep up what they're doing now, it's $750 billion a year. If they keep doing $750 billion a year, and of course they would keep increasing it because of the effect of inflation. Over a 10-year period, most probably the military budget would expand from the current, $780 billion now to, and that doesn't include Homeland Security, by the way. Maybe it would go from 780 billion to a top of 1.2 trillion and would average maybe 900 billion. We're probably looking at spending 9 trillion over the military if the future is like the past. So what they're saying here is we can afford to spend only 2.3 trillion on the climate, but we can afford to spend $9 trillion on the military, and we can also afford to spend combining government spending on healthcare and private spending on healthcare. We're currently spending $4 trillion a year. That's our healthcare spending, $4 trillion a year. Okay. It probably over 10 years will grow to be in the neighborhood of $50 to $60 trillion in healthcare spending. And we're not willing to spend more than $2.3 trillion on our own survival. This is ridiculous. Thea says things are fair at best. Every day is still a struggle. Not to complain, but it seems the economy around me is still stagnant around here. Thea says, how are you holding up, Lana? Kay says, we should have had Bernie president. Yep. If we had Bernie president, this would have been a $5 trillion bill. Lana says, I am okay. Still working a lot of hours. Scheduled my first vaccine shot. Evelina says, okay, we're fucked. Terry says, gimmicky, perfect word for incrementalism. Kay says, water is awful here in Northeast Ohio. Dia says, long hours is my story as well. Overnight caregiver. I signed up for the J&J, but it looks like that's on hold now because of the human error reported today. Oh, that's awful. Terry says, when the climate and environment improve, so will the health of humanity. Terry says, Medicare for all won't cost as much. Oh no, Medicare for all will not cost as much. Medicare for all, let's say over 10 years, total health spending under the present system would be $55 trillion. then roughly speaking, if we have a Medicare for All program, we're going to save $18 trillion off that, which will lower our spending by roughly $1.8 trillion per year. That would pay for the climate emergency by itself. At least based on cost estimates that say it's going to be $16 trillion or $18 trillion or something like that. I think it's going to be more because there are going to be cost overruns. There are going to be other things we think of. There are going to be crises we have to cope with. If we are estimating it at $16.3 trillion, it's going to be twice that much. Kay says Medicare for all would at least be fair to all people. Terry Burke says, I'll gladly go around and pick up trash and debris for at least $15 an hour. Lana says, I saw that mess. They had to throw the medicine vaccine away. What a waste. Thea says, unfathomable waste. I haven't read the article, but that has to be pure incompetence. I'd like to know the exact the conditions. I'd like to find out whose incompetence that was. But I'll tell you, it wasn't Chinese incompetence. Terry Burke says, easy peasy green job under the FJG, under the hashtag FJG, hashtag GND. The Swift says with the platinum coins. Kay says, that would be great, Joe. Evelyn says, you're asking small minds to be creative, Joe. No, I'm not asking small minds to be creative. I'm just asking them to watch one of my videos every once in a while. Kay says, hell, when I live in downtown Canton, Ohio, I picked up trash every day. Evelina says, and for free, right? Laugh out loud. And Kay says, yes, Evelina, it was bad. Teresa Santa says, hola, peeps. He's a maniac. And Evelina says, Biden's team is working against the president. We know it's not working for the people. Oh, Biden's team is not a unitary creature. It's got lots of different people on it who think, okay, in different ways. There probably are some people who will be working against the interests of the president and working for the interests of the companies they came from and hope to go back to. Yes, I agree. But there are others that I'm sure are trying to work in his interest. Thea Swift says, hi, Teresa. Maybe we'd be in better shape if Kamala would take over. No, I don't think we would be. I just have this feeling about Kamala that she is one of those mean girls. Just a mean girl. I get that impression from her. I mean, I get big Hillary Clinton vibes from Harris all the time. She laughs at things. I have no idea what she's laughing at. She makes jokes. I have no idea why they're jokes. I think she's entitled. She is privileged. I really don't like her at all. Lana says, there's Teresa. Lana says, I can picture Bonnie driving the bike and Dr. Joe in the sidecar. Ha ha. No, it would have to be the other way around, believe me, Lana. How about shrinking the war machine? Is he going to do anything about that? Nothing contaminates more than war, says Evelina. Kay says Austin, Texas hires low income and homeless people to pick up the trash on the streets for $10 an hour. It gives them a place to live. Works in Texas, so what does that tell you? Well, if they get $10 an hour and they get a place to live for free, uh, then that's probably not too far from the $15 an hour, right? How much does it cost to rent a place in Austin, Texas? Rents are probably fairly high there, right? But Dia says that's a very beatnik scenario, Lana. Evelina says it tells me the left is full of it and mediocre. Evelina says by left making Dems. Evelina says she means the Dems. Terry Burke says, thanks for the links, Dr. F. Sure, Terry. Evelina says, only seemingly better than repubs. Not much different. No. They are different. They are different. We see differences already, in terms of the way they're acting. I mean, I'll be the first to tell you. They're not doing anything revolutionary. They've done temporary stuff. Okay, and they're doing a few things more than temporary with respect to the new proposals that Biden is putting forward. Okay, at this point, it isn't nearly what we need, but it was better than what the Republicans were giving us. AOC is good with numbers, like Katie. Says Terry Burke, and Kay says Austin is a very blue spot in red Texas. I know it is. I've been to Austin. And Teresa says, hi, you're all drilling holes in potato planting buckets while listening. It's just tra-la-la like the Bulgarians. Evelina Pont, that's just it, Kay. Dems projects are spotty at the most, Dia said. I thought you'd say Bernard Sanders, Dr. Joe. Bernie should enlist Kelton in on the framework. Well, he probably already did. She probably got a chance to read and critique and make suggestions on the framework for a Green New Deal. I mean, who would he ask if not for Stephanie? She was a campaign advisor at the time. She had been working for him, in the budget committee. And then he took her onto the campaign. Kay says, I know Evelina is sad. Evelina says, spotty at best. Kay says, but when those plans work, they should be expanded. But we need something now that is going to be so overwhelming in how it works that it destroys all chances for the Republicans to win in 2023. Things are just too close at this point. If the Republicans were to take over the government again, we would see at least 2 more years of climate poisoning. I mean, we're seeing people on the Republican side who are just as bad as Bolsonaro in Brazil. We can't have that. We already lost 4 years of being able to do anything about this under Trump. We can't afford any more time. We can't afford to have the Republicans even have a ghost of a chance of getting back in 2022. This bill is our chance to throw them out of any possibility of winning in 2022. If the bill is big enough, if it is stimulative enough, if it creates true full employment, tight full employment, with wages going up fast, that is what we need. If there is any inflation on the horizon or that gets close, there are ways to handle it. There are ways to handle it then, at that time. We don't have to hold ourselves back now. We need to spend for full employment. In fact, we need to get the federal job guarantee into this infrastructure bill. That's what we need to do. Dia Swift says, but Teresa, I just threw green bean seeds in the yard and they're growing like wildfire, but the rats ate my celery, laugh out loud. And Evelina says, pay bill is so outdated, you mean pay go, yeah. And Terry says, corporations are the neoliberal vitriol. Teresa says, Dia Swift, kind of early for green beans in my area, Oklahoma. Where are you? Dia says, I'm in South Georgia. Dia says, in South Georgia. Correction, Teresa says, Georgia. Well, good for growing. The shite, politically, sad. Isn't Oklahoma the shite politically, too? Terry Burke says, grandpa charm. You mean Joe Stiglitz? Yeah. Terry Burke says, Sarah Palin encourages mask wearing after revealing COVID-19 diagnosis. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Evelina says, yes, I suppose so. Dia Swift says, Dr. Joe, master negotiator. I wouldn't say that necessarily. I don't hold any brief for, from my negotiating skills. I suppose I have a sense for that. And I can be a very tough negotiator, that's true. Terry says, let's strike Joe Stiglitz then? Well, let's not go that far. In other words, Joe is friendly with Stephanie. He's friendly with Jamie. He's friendly with our people. They can explain things to him. He can be brought around. If he had gotten into this administration in a key position, it would have been very, very good for us. If he had become the head of the National Economics Council, it would have been very, very good for us. Lana says, Stiglitz, friend of Galbraith. Yes. Teresa says, if we had Bernie president, they would assassinate him. He'd really have to watch out. They'd probably try. Terry Burke says, makes perfect sense, Medicare for all, EST. Terry Burke says, a contractor screwed up the vaccines. Private sector, again. Private sector. I think vaccine research and manufacturing should be taken over by the government. I don't think the private sector should be involved in it. If a contractor screwed up the vaccines, they were screwing it up because they were looking for profit. Kay says, I don't like Kamala at all. And Teresa says, I don't like Kamala either. Terry says, no to sadistic Kamala. And whatever man says, yep, you're right, Joe, Kamala gives off big Hillary vibes. Kamala laughed, then said no when asked if she was going to visit the southern border. Yeah, why did she laugh at that question? Why did she laugh? Why was that funny? With what was going on at the southern border with kids. Why is that funny? Evelina says, I'll take that back then. Dems are different, just not as ambitious. Well, also, they're bought. They're bought a great deal of the time and to a substantial degree by business interests. There's no question about that. And she says, meanwhile, the Dem plan is not propelling us forward enough. Yeah. They're not doing what they have to do. Teresa Sena says, I heard FDR's New Deal didn't come in one bill, but had successive addendums. Yes, okay, shy too. Yeah. But in those days, the Southerners were not using the filibuster against the New Deal. So, and FDR had very large majorities in the Senate, okay, and in the House too. There was no such thing, okay, as reconciliation. He could pass 50 bills if he wanted to in a particular session. It was majority rule in the Senate as well as in the House. Nancy Gossett Blackmore says, thanks for tonight, Dr. Joe. Thank you, Nancy. Dia Swift says, hell of a point, screwing up for profit. Kay says, nothing funny about the border, but Kamala is privileged. Yeah, Terry Burke says, perhaps she thought about the quote, run for the border commercial. Oh, God. That's awful. Okay, thanks, folks. I'm going to say good night. But tomorrow, if I can get through the preparations, okay, and if some hot stuff doesn't intervene, I'll be doing the program on the politics, okay, of Medicare for All as it relates to activism on social media. Okay, what I want to do is relate the political movement behind getting Medicare for All passed to the people in Congress and to social media efforts that bubble up from the bottom, or at least from the media activists on the progressive side. Okay? So I want to do that tomorrow. If I don't have time to complete my preparations for that, then I will certainly take care of it on Saturday. So that was a suggestion, okay, of Lana's. So that's what I'm going to do. So Kay says, Dolores says, thank you and good night. And Kay says, thank you all for a great discussion. Love you all. We love you, Kay. And Terry says, sweet dreams, hot stuff. Okay, thanks, folks. I'll see you tomorrow at 9.